We people of faith believe we're welcoming everybody, but are we really? In our facilities, in our worship, in the very way we present ourselves? Well, today we talk on Austin Faith Dialogue about accessibility for all. Stay with us for today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
We're glad you've joined us today on Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and what we're doing is examining accessibility and the community of faith because the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed about 11 years ago. It's time for us to look at where we are. And our guests today are Tina Hike on the staff of First United Methodist Church and Bill Carter. Good to have you too, Bill. You're a member of First Church and on the church's Accessibility Committee, right?
Yes.
Tina, I think we ought to set the stage first and perhaps talk about some of the theological reasons why we perhaps have not been welcoming and how we need to welcome all of God's brothers and sisters into our houses of worship.
I think theologically Jesus was pretty clear that everyone needs to be welcome, and Jesus was in the habit of welcoming those on the margins, those who couldn't walk, the paralytic who was lowered in from the rooftop by his friends. As a church, I don't really know why we've failed in that task, but oftentimes we have failed in that task, and perhaps it's because we get comfortable with who we are and forget that how we function isn't how everyone functions. And part of our responsibility is to push our comfort zone out so that we can imagine how it might be to come into a house of worship if you're differently abled. Certainly most of our churches are not equipped to have the roof removed to lower paralytics in, but we can do some things to remove barriers to those who are differently abled in terms of mobility or in terms of mental processing. And in order to do that in a good way, we need to be honest about how good we are at it. All of us want to be good at that. All of us want to welcome everyone. One of the ways you can find out whether or not you're good at that is by having someone who is differently able to come and join you in worship and then walk through worship with them to see what they see and run into the barriers that they run into. And in doing that, you can do a lot to open up your congregation in ways that you may not have imagined.
A real eye-opener, and we'll get back to some of the specifics because a lot of folks like a checklist kind of approach. But you talked about broadening your boundaries, enlarging your horizons, and I know that's been your experience, Bill, and much of what you'll talk about is your experience rather than, say, professional training. And your experience is that of being a parent of a child who is different. Describe a little bit about the journey that you've gone through.
Well, my son Eric, who's 13 years old, has autism, and we, as is typical, discovered that when he was about 2 years old. And he grew up in the church. We brought him to the nursery and so forth, and there were no accessibility issues early on. Then, of course, as his developmental disability began to be more apparent and to pose some challenges to the child care situation at the church, we did have to begin working through how can we make this work. And I frankly was very concerned about whether it would work, whether he would ever be able to go into the church because of his extreme hyperactivity. And it's been sort of a series of miracles that have led to the point where he is very active in the church now. But it definitely required a lot of special effort. And I think that I did become aware of the fact that the church does need to spend some time working with someone who has that disability to figure out how to make that work for a particular person. And so it's something I think you can't anticipate and be entirely prepared for before the person shows up, especially if it's a new disability that hasn't been encountered before.
You talk about a person showing up, and yet your experience was that your son grew up in this church. How do you suppose the experience would be or is different for someone with a disability who does just show up? What are they likely to encounter?
Well, specifically to Eric, Eric's disability requires him or makes him more dependent on routine, more dependent on things being familiar to him. So he has some difficulty being calm and being in the flow of things in an unfamiliar setting. So I would imagine another person with his disability coming into a new church would, first of all, just be likely to be in some degree of distress and need to become familiar with it. On the other side, I think people who don't live with someone with disability, are not familiar with people with a disability, will obviously be somewhat anxious about how to behave and what to expect. So it's just a more challenging getting to know you process for people with disabilities. And I think that is just what really helps is having a place in which people can come that's very low stress, that's not formal worship, but a place where people can begin to get to know the person with disabilities, either in a very informal fellowship type of activity, possibly in classes. And Eric has continued to be very active in the classes of the church, and particularly the youth program at our church has been very good at working with him.
And that says a lot about different kinds of entry points. Well, Tina, that makes me think of a question for you. Now, part of your responsibility is designing and leading worship, which most of us would think would be a normal, a natural entry point. What is it like to design worship with your sensibility for including everybody? How is that different, your process?
It's radically different if you keep in mind that part of your responsibility is always to remain open to those who are differently abled. Because as a pastor, then, you have to think liturgically not only through the scripture that you're worshiping with and the message that is to be delivered, but how the faith community might respond. For instance, there's a church in town that has a Sunday school class comprised of adults who are mentally differently abled. Many of them have Down syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome. And what happens in worship, if you are the pastor at that church and you ask a rhetorical question in your sermon, you are sure to get an answer from a raised hand in the front row. And so if you're not prepared to understand that your congregation is going to be radically different, if you aren't prepared for interruptions in your service, if you aren't ready to say it's okay, then it can be very stressful when you're designing a worship service. And in fact, most pastors have to worry so much about the scripture that they are preparing for and the message that they are delivering that these details often elude us.
How does someone then who's designing worship or leading a congregation in any of a number of settings, how does someone become prepared?
If they are very gifted, they have a church where there's an accessibility team. And that team is comprised of folks in the community who are related to someone who is differently abled or who have an intense interest in that area. And when it works well, the team really helps the pastor by asking questions like, gee, do you really want to do it that way? Because then someone in can't take communion. And so that's a perfect setting. If you don't have that kind of opportunity as a pastor, then you almost always have to put yourself in the path of those who are differently abled, whether you do that in mission or you intentionally put yourself in the midst of people who are differently abled. I think that's one of the most effective ways to become aware so that you can prepare more carefully.
And you refer to team, which is exactly what you're doing with part of your time, Bill. How is this team at First United Methodist structured? Who's on it and what do you folks do?
There are, I believe, about 6 or 7 of us active at any given time. One of us is in a wheelchair, is confined to a wheelchair. Most of us are family members of people with a variety of different abilities. And we looked for church resources and found that there are some. There's, I believe, a disability program within the United Methodist Church that has developed literature, has developed a checklist for auditing a church to find where are possible challenges for accessibility to people with a variety of disabilities.
What would some of those things on the checklist be? Do you remember some of them?
Well, the physical accessibility is the most well-defined, and of course the ADA has developed a lot of very specific guidelines in that regard. First United Methodist Church is an older church that has a lot of very inaccessible points. And if I may, a funny story, one of the committees that makes decisions about the finances of the church meets in our library, which is completely inaccessible to anyone with a mobility impairment. So we were planning possibly to dig through the roof of that room and lower our wheelchair-bound member in to meet with them, because that's their regular meeting place. But there are checklists like that. I don't believe the checklist includes things related to developmental differences, but some things would include settings where lighting would be a problem, where any particularly bad noise problems or excessive activity. Most of those things don't become a big issue for churches, I don't believe.
And the team meets and speaks to the congregation, or does it work through some of the other structures in the church?
We have so far mainly worked with the committees that deal with the physical plant, talking about how to improve accessibility in the places that are still not very accessible. The other main activity has been to have an Access for All Sunday, in which we prominently involved people with different abilities and in the worship, in all the worship services that weekend, and made all of the pastors made a real point of bringing that into the theme of their sermons and of the whole liturgy. And it was we got a lot of good comments back that had raised a lot of awareness and had begun the process of working on additional accessibility. One of the things that came out was a lot of members of the church who were older have impairments in hearing and sight and so forth, and we're making use of resources that are standard for helping address that. Microphones for people with hearing impairment, large print liturgies for the people with sight impairments, and that's really helped us develop a number of tools.
And I can certainly see the value of raising awareness. Changes can happen little by little that way. Well, we'll come back in the next part of the show and talk about specific anecdotes, talk about use of language even when talking about disability, and focus a little bit more on why this is important for us as people of faith. So we'll see you in the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue. Stay with us. You joined us on Austin Faith Dialogue today when we're talking about, as we get close to the anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, talking about how we as people of faith can make our places of worship more accessible, more inviting for all. And we have Bill Carter and Tina Hike, both of First United Methodist Church. Good to have you. We were talking some, and talking I noticed very carefully during the first half, using sometimes different terms instead of the word disability. And Tina, I know this is an area interest of yours, the whole use of language and how that conditions the experience of faith.
Language makes a big difference on how we worship and how we think about who we are as a community. One of the things that the accessibility team did that I thought was wonderful was they made the decision on Access for All Saturday and Sunday not to call it Disability Weekend, which is what the literature had been suggesting, but to call it Access for All, indicating that we are all children of God and we are all made with special talents and abilities. They may be different than the mainstream, but that doesn't make them any less valued. And so when we use words like differently abled rather than disabled, what we're doing is calling out the differences that are real and true, but also calling out the fact that as beloved children of God and as unique children of God, we are all valued. I'll tell you, though, that that term drove my daughter crazy.
How so?
On Accessibility Saturday, my daughter agreed to sign the service for me. And what that meant was she would sign the sermon, because everything else really is projected on a screen on the wall and so is easily readable. As long as you can read, if you are deaf, you have no impairments to worship other than the sermon. Well, she came in to sign the sermon, and I used the word differently abled several times, which isn't really a word, so she had to finger spell it every time it came up in the sermon. Her hands were tired at the end. But what we also learned from that experience was, her point was that the worship service as it's designed, the Saturday worship service, because it's projected and because all of the words are on the screen and because the sermon is printed and available at the side, it's actually fully accessible if you are hearing impaired or deaf. And so we don't necessarily need an interpreter at that service, which was a nice thing to learn that we wouldn't have necessarily learned had we not had someone from the outside come in and think through some of those issues on our behalf.
And that would probably eventually lead you to think about people who have different mental abilities, which makes me then want to ask you a little bit more, Bill, about your experiences with Eric. Because your entry point in the church was not worship, but rather it was the child care system at the church. What was that like for you and for Eric?
Well, I think it was maybe the easiest way to gain entry to accessibility for someone in the church, because it's a very gradual process. Child care situations are very flexible. They tend to be ready to deal with a lot of different situations. What we did find, though, was that Eric's behavior did present real challenges. He's hyperactive and did have a tendency to have some aggression when, particularly with child care workers who worked with him extensively. And so we did have, I pulled together some literature, especially from the school system as we'd worked through preparing Eric in preschool, and found ways that the aides, teaching aides are trained and prepared would transfer to the child care situation. We had some in-services where people would come in and work with the child care staff. I put together resource packets, a little write-up on explaining who Eric was and the behavior strategies we have for him, and over a period of time prepared the staff. Eventually we found that we were going to need additional volunteers that would become very familiar with him and work with him. And so working some with the church staff, I developed a pool of volunteers who rotated Sundays and have continued even now when he's 13 and in the youth program, come and basically accompany him through the program, even though he's getting very close to being independent of that. But that's a real educational process that involved having a pool of volunteers that work with him on an extended basis, and that I think that type of support is often needed. It's not reasonable to expect that everyone with a different ability can come in and flow freely, independently in all the church settings.
I'm struck by the amount of time and energy and care you put into this. Yes, your son, but still a lot of you. What resources were available to you during all this?
Early on, most of the resources were connected to the school system and the state MHMR, or actually the local office of MHMR. Eric did come under a program that's available through MHMR for developmental disabilities, and there were staff that were assigned to him to help with the after-school programs. And those people did make themselves available to work with the schools and with the church. I would say that was the main support network. There's also a group called Pilot Parent that works in conjunction with the ARC of Austin. And that's a wonderful program because it pairs up families who've newly discovered a disability in their family with other families that are close to the same place but a little further along, so that they can coach them in what services are available and just coping strategies in the home and in the community.
Exactly. So what about, Tina, then, for churches that want to step out and get beyond thinking that accessibility is just installing a ramp? What support services, what encouragement is available for the churches?
Well, the United Methodist Church has information in the Book of Discipline, but also through the United Methodist Church Office, the National Church Office, there are resources that can help you understand as a pastor and as a congregation what kind of issues you might be facing and what options you have. Much of the literature from the liturgy support for Access for All Sunday came from the United Methodist Church. And so those kind of resources are always there. And the MHMR, the local MHMR office, we often find what happens with churches is we gain access to information and support about persons with different abilities through our missions programs. We are involved with the Health and Human Services departments and often MHMR through our missions in the church. And through that back channel, we often get fed resources for folks who are differently abled. So if you have a missions center that's very well connected to your church, then that's going to backfeed your worship and liturgy and your welcoming ability, really.
And not everybody who watches the show is United Methodist necessarily. So have you run across things that would be helpful to mosques, to synagogues, to churches of other denominations?
Mm-hmm. I know that the Jewish Coalition also has resources available for worship in this kind of setting. And the Austin Area Interreligious Ministries Office, they've just recently changed their name, promotes a dialogue within those kinds of faith communities in a very open way. And those kinds of dialogues, just as mission is a backdoor to getting those resources, those kinds of common dialogues, interreligious, are often helpful in terms of helping each other understand what differently abled people might need in worship.
Bill, if you were going to design the ideal church environment for you and for your son Eric, what would it look like?
That would be very hard to say in any definitive way. I think more than particular way that the church would be set up or organized would be that an opportunity for people with different abilities to enter into dialogue, to enter into an informal place where they can get to know people in the church. I think it's getting to know the people with disabilities that's the critical starting point. That there aren't any really well-defined things that can be set up ahead of time that will work perfectly. I think it's really the fellowship. It's really the sharing of lives with people with disabilities that makes the opportunity open for the church life to really open up to the individuals. And I think what I've found with Eric is that he has become a real treasure within the church. And it's so different from what I expected. I expected a real struggle all along the way, and knew that his hyperactivity and so forth would likely make it hard for him to participate. But what's happened is he's become someone who's just always been there for 13 years, and people know him well, and he's become so comfortable, and his joy and his energy just bubble out whenever he's around the church, that he just lights up the room. And just having been there and having been in relationship with so many people there, I think is what's really made the difference.
So a practical question, we've got a couple minutes left here, a practical question, Tina, for someone who's on a church staff. Some folks might say, this costs too much. We don't have the money for someone who signs, for the intensive attention that someone with autism or other mental disabilities would require. We don't have the money for someone to come in and do signing. What do you do with that?
You know, sometimes that's a reality. Sometimes when a need is presented, you don't have the resources right at hand in order to be able to meet that need. As a community of faith, best case scenario is that you pray about not having the resources to meet that need, and you take the steps toward meeting the need anyway, trusting that somehow the resources will come in the form of money or humans or whatever it is that's needed. I think that standing still is probably not the best option for a faith community. I think even in the face of scarce resources, taking steps in the correct direction of providing an ability for everyone to be present is probably the right way to go. And that probably for us as a faith community starts with prayer.
And now you're still in seminary, a little bit left to go. So if you could design seminary curriculum to address accessibility issues, what would you include or exclude?
I think that I would include more students that are differently abled in seminaries. I think that that is the best way to help us as a community of faith, ministers, all of us, become aware of what's needed. It's the best, most personal and most real way, because the truth is people with different abilities are all over. And if you don't have any in your community, then maybe there's something that's not quite right with your community. So if you open up and allow those persons with different abilities to come in, you will automatically make yourself more aware of what's going on. And I think if I could ideally design a seminary, I would ideally design a seminary with a diverse community that contained persons with different abilities.
So on a practical note then, Bill, to help the local church welcome people with all kinds of abilities, how would you suggest that folks watching set up an accessibility committee, or whatever they might choose to call it?
I should mention right away that the pilot parent program has an outreach specifically for accessibility. They are interested in doing in-services with churches to figure these things out. So I'd make use of that resource if at all possible. They're at the Ark of Austin. I think discussing among the pastoral staff and anyone who's interested to find who are the people already in the church who have disabilities. We've been really blessed with a few very persistent people who continue to come despite all the accessibility issues. Steve Rooks, who's our person in a wheelchair, has really raised a lot of awareness simply by coming and making himself present.
Look around, folks are there, God's presence is there. Thank you both for coming for an all too short conversation. Tina and Bill, it's been really good to have you. And it's been really good to have you on Austin Faith Dialogue this week. We'll see you here again next week.